I woke up to the gentle gray of a clouded morning sky, the light filtering softly through the thin curtains of my bedroom. There was no rush in the air, no noise from the street, no sharp alarm. Just the faint hum of the radiator and the distant sound of a bird outside, chirping once, then falling silent. I lay there for a moment, nestled in the warmth of my blanket, eyes still half closed, breathing in the stillness. Eventually, I sat up and let my feet find the floor. It was cool to the touch, not cold, but enough to bring a slight shiver through my spine. I stood slowly, stretching my arms upward, my fingers grazing the air above me. The bones in my shoulders made a soft pop, the kind of sound I always found oddly satisfying. I made my way to the kitchen, padding quietly down the hallway. The wooden floors creaked in their usual places. I liked knowing those spots. It made the apartment feel lived in, familiar. The kettle waited on the counter, just where I'd left it the night before. I filled it with water and set it to boil. Then I reached for the small jar of loose leaf tea from the cabinet above the sink. I always take a moment here, just to watch the steam start to curl, to listen to the quiet bubbling of water slowly heating. As the kettle began to hum, I opened the curtains in the living room. The sky outside was soft and pale, the buildings across the street blurred slightly by the early light. I could just make out the silhouette of the tree outside the window, its branches unmoving, as though the day hadn't quite started breathing yet. When the water was ready, I poured it carefully over the tea leaves and let it steep. The aroma drifted upward, earthy, faintly floral. I cupped the mug with both hands and took my first sip as I settled at the small kitchen table. The warmth moved through me slowly, like sunlight spreading across a cold floor. It was then, in the stillness of that moment, that I realized I was almost out of milk. I leaned back slightly and opened the fridge with one hand. The familiar chill met my face. I spotted the carton on the top shelf, nearly empty. There might be enough left for tomorrow's tea, but not for much else. I scanned the rest of the fridge. 2 eggs, a small wedge of cheddar, half a cucumber, 1 lonely carrot. The shelves looked more bare than I had remembered. I sipped again and set the mug down gently. It was time to go grocery shopping. But I never just rush out the door. No, I prefer to ease into it, to make a list, to check every corner of the kitchen, to move through the process deliberately. I reached for the notepad that lived on the side of the fridge, held in place by a small round magnet shaped like a strawberry. The pages were curled at the corners from use, the top sheet blank except for a faint shadow of ink from the list before. I sat at the table and held the pen loosely, letting my mind wander through the cabinets and drawers. First, the fridge. I opened it fully this time, resting my hand on the door. The light buzzed softly. Oat milk, nearly gone. Eggs, just 2 left. Cheese, I noted that the cheddar was slightly dry around the edges, still good but nearly finished. I added all 3 to the list: milk, eggs, cheese. In the vegetable drawer, the cucumber and carrot looked tired. I added lettuce, then paused, thinking of how nice a bit of spinach might be this week. I wrote that down too. Then the pantry. I opened the narrow wooden door and breathed in the familiar scent of dried herbs, cardboard, and rice. I lifted the jar of jasmine rice. Only a few spoonfuls remained. The lentils were low too. Pasta was uncertain. I scribbled all 3. After a moment, I walked over to the bread box. Empty. I sighed softly. Bread, then. And maybe a treat, a small chocolate bar, or perhaps a muffin if the bakery section had something fresh. I reread the list, tapping the pen gently against the paper. I always read my list twice. Not because I think I've forgotten something, but because I like the rhythm of the words. The way they help me mentally prepare. As if seeing the items again helps me step more fully into the quiet task ahead. I folded the paper neatly, and placed it next to my mug. Next came the choice of bag. I keep my reusable shopping bags in a soft cloth bin by the door. Over the years, I've collected quite a few, some plain canvas, others brightly patterned, a few with slogans from markets or bookstores. I reached for the dark green one with wide handles. It's sturdy, a little faded at the edges, and always comfortable on my shoulder. I tucked the folded list into the small inner pocket and zipped it shut. Back in the bedroom, I chose something simple to wear, soft gray pants and a navy sweater, with sleeves that hang a bit long over my wrists. I brushed my hair slowly, tying it back with a small elastic. A few loose strands framed my face. I didn't bother with makeup. I rarely do on days like this. By the door, I slipped on my shoes, black walking flats that have molded to the shape of my feet over time. I ran a finger down the front of my coat to smooth it, then patted my pockets. Keys, phone, wallet, all there. Just before leaving, I stood for a moment in the center of my living room and glanced around. The morning light had grown slightly brighter, casting soft shadows across the floor. The apartment was still, peaceful, the kind of quiet that feels earned. Then I opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and began the short, familiar journey to the store. The moment I stepped outside, I felt the difference in the air. It was cool but not cold, the kind of temperature that makes you breathe a little deeper. The clouds overhead were soft and low, stretching across the sky in wide, unbroken layers. No wind, just a quiet stillness that clung to the buildings and sidewalks like a light fog. I stood for a few seconds at the top of the steps, adjusting the strap of my bag on my shoulder and tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. Then I began to walk, slowly, letting my footsteps set their own pace. The neighborhood was calm, in that in-between time after most commuters had gone and before the midday walkers came out. The sidewalks were speckled with fallen leaves, small, dry, mostly yellow, gathered in quiet little clusters along the curbs. I avoided stepping directly on them. Not for any reason, really, just habit. As I passed the apartment building next door, I glanced at the row of planters along the front porch. Someone had recently watered them. Tiny droplets still clung to the rims of the pots. Rosemary, thyme, and mint, their scents faintly noticeable even as I kept moving. I took a slow breath in and let it out, smiling slightly. At the corner, I paused at the crosswalk. A few cars passed, their tires making soft sounds on the pavement. Across the street, a man walked with a small terrier in a blue harness. The dog trotted confidently, its ears perked and tail curled high. I watched them for a moment as they disappeared around the bend. When the light changed, I stepped onto the crosswalk. The sound of my shoes tapping gently against the painted lines felt unusually clear. I walked with ease, my mind wandering just slightly, not in any specific direction, but gently drifting, like a leaf on water. Soon, I reached the small park that sits halfway between my apartment and the grocery store. I always take this route. Even if it's a few minutes longer, I enjoy the calm of the park path. Today, the benches were empty. A few squirrels darted across the grass, rustling through leaves and pausing now and then to look around. The path curved gently past a row of birch trees. Their white bark, mottled with gray, stood out softly against the dull green of the grass. I brushed my hand against one of the trunks as I passed, a light touch, nothing more, and kept walking. On the far side of the park, I rejoined the sidewalk. The grocery store was just a few blocks away now. I passed a small corner bakery, its windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside. Through the glass, I could see trays of fresh bread being arranged on shelves, long loaves with crisp golden crusts, rows of rolls dusted with flour. The smell drifted out through the open doorway, a mix of yeast, sugar, and something faintly spicy, maybe cinnamon. I paused for just a moment outside, letting the scent wash over me. I wasn't planning to buy bread today, but the thought of a warm roll with butter made my stomach stir slightly. Still, I kept walking. A few paces later, I reached the familiar storefront of the grocery store. Brick walls, large glass doors, and the green awning fluttering slightly at the corners. A row of metal carts stood neatly aligned near the entrance, each one reflecting a soft morning light. I stood still for a moment, not hurrying to go in. I always pause before entering, a small habit, but it helps me shift my focus. Outside is the world of sidewalks and trees and distant dogs. Inside is another kind of rhythm, quieter, slower, but different. A place of aisles and choices, of small decisions and simple comforts. I adjusted my grip on the strap of my bag, stepped forward, and let the doors slide open with a gentle hiss. It was time to begin. The automatic doors slid open with a soft sigh, and I stepped into the store's familiar, temperature-controlled stillness. A faint coolness settled on my face as the shift from outdoor air to indoor air registered on my skin. The soundscape changed instantly, from the gentle noise of the street to a blend of muted instrumental music, distant beeps of scanners, and the low rumble of refrigeration units humming along the far wall. I paused just past the threshold, letting the doors close behind me before moving forward. There was never any reason to rush. I liked to stand there for a moment, surveying the scene like I was arriving at a quiet museum. The lighting was bright but soft, not harsh like in some larger stores. Here, everything seemed a bit more muted, almost as if the store itself respected the quiet mood of its shoppers. The air carried a subtle mix of smells, fresh produce, floral arrangements, and a hint of something clean and lemon-scented, likely from the recently mopped floor near the entrance. The scent was comforting in a way I never really noticed until now. I reached for one of the red handheld baskets stacked beside the floral display. They were always tidy, nested neatly, handles folded in. I gently tugged one free, checked the handle for smooth movement, and lowered it to my side. To my left was a small cluster of seasonal items, chrysanthemums this time of year, mostly yellow and burgundy, each bunch wrapped in brown paper and resting in galvanized buckets of water. I leaned slightly to breathe in the faint, spicy scent of the petals. I rarely buy flowers at the grocery store, but I always pause here, just to look. There's something reassuring about their quiet beauty near the store's threshold, as if they're there to greet you. A few feet ahead, a woman with a toddler was gently steering a half-filled cart toward the produce section. The child, maybe 2 years old, sat quietly among paper towels and a box of cereal, humming to himself and holding a toy with both hands. Their calmness set the tone for the rest of the store. I turned toward the left and began walking, slowly, quietly, letting the wheels of the cart ahead of me roll out of earshot. The polished tile floor reflected the fluorescent lights overhead in dull smudges of white, like the surface of a gentle stream catching sunlight through clouds. To my right, shelves of greeting cards stood in perfect rows. I let my fingers brush against the edge of the display as I passed. Birthdays, condolences, congratulations, each one with its own soft color and elegant typeface. I didn't stop to read them, just passed by as a small acknowledgement of their presence. As I moved deeper into the store, I became more aware of the rhythm. The occasional rustle of a paper bag, the beep of a distant register, the squeak of a cartwheel somewhere in another aisle. Each sound was quiet, but distinct, like notes in a sparse melody. I matched my pace to the mood, allowing my footsteps to remain light, slow, even. And then I saw it, the produce section. Bright and colorful and orderly, stretching across the front corner of the store like a painter's palette. This, I always thought, was the heart of the supermarket, where the colors lived. where the shopping truly began. I shifted the basket in my hand slightly and walked toward it, ready to begin the slow, careful ritual of choosing fruits and vegetables, one by one, without hurry. The produce section was arranged like a quiet, symmetrical garden, a soft, refrigerated landscape of color and texture. I slowed my pace even more as I entered, basket in hand, eyes moving gently from one display to the next. The lighting here was slightly cooler, reflecting off metal bins and smooth-skinned fruits, making everything feel crisp and fresh. To my left, apples were displayed in deep rows, stacked like bricks, rows of red, yellow, green. I drifted toward them almost without thinking. There's always something comforting about choosing apples. Maybe it's their regularity, or the way they seem unchanged by trends. I reached for a Honeycrisp and gently rolled it in my hand, checking for bruises. The skin was taut, dappled with pale that's like snowflakes on blush. I placed it in my basket and added 2 more, one slightly larger, one with a natural blemish on the side that made it seem more real. Next were bananas. I scanned the bunches, looking for one just beginning to ripen. Too green, and they'd sit uneaten for days. Too spotty, and they'd turn to mush too soon. I found a small bunch of 4, yellow with a touch of freckling near the stems. Their curve felt natural in my hand, the slight softness reassuring. As I moved to the citrus section, the smell began to change. Brighter, sharper, a mix of lemon oil and orange peel. I didn't need lemons, but I stopped to admire them anyway. Their waxy skins and vibrant color glowed beneath the overhead lights, and I picked one up just to hold it, just to breathe it in. Eventually, I returned it to its place and kept walking. The green bins of leafy vegetables came next. I paused in front of the lettuce, romaine, butter, red leaf. Each bundle slightly damp, wrapped loosely in plastic, resting like bouquets. I selected a head of romaine with tight ribs and fresh edges. Its slight weight in my hand gave me a tiny thrill of satisfaction. I added spinach next, baby leaves, packed into a soft, rustling bag. I gave it a light squeeze to check for dampness and was pleased to feel only cool air between the leaves. I passed a small display of herbs, parsley, cilantro, dill, their scents mixing in the air above the crates. A sprig of dill had fallen to the floor, resting like a feather, almost too delicate to disturb. I stepped around it carefully. The cucumbers were smooth, glossy, lined up like soldiers. I chose 2, gently squeezing for firmness. They gave just enough to let me know they were fresh. I placed them on top of the lettuce, adjusting the basket slightly to balance the weight. Nearby, the tomatoes were nestled together in small clusters, bright red, plump, and warm from the overhead light. I lifted one, then another, and finally selected 3 that were just the right blend of firmness and yield. Each one had that subtle scent of summer that only truly fresh tomatoes seem to carry. Near the corner of the section, avocados were arranged in wide wooden crates, sorted by ripeness. I gently pressed my thumb against the side of one. Too firm. The next gave a little. I held it up to eye level, turning it slowly to check the skin for cracks or bruises. Satisfied, I added it to the basket, then chose one more, slightly softer, for a meal tomorrow. The peppers caught my attention next. Red, yellow, green, and orange, lined up like colored lanterns. I ran my fingers over a red one, smooth and slightly waxy, and picked it up. It felt heavy for its size, a good sign. I added a yellow pepper for variety and admired how the colors looked together in my basket, red next to green spinach, yellow nestled between cucumbers. The onions and garlic were piled at the far end. Their skins rustled lightly in the cool air. I selected a small yellow onion, feeling its dense weight, then picked a bulb of garlic, white, slightly papery, just beginning to separate at the top. I rarely need more than one bulb, and I prefer the feel of choosing it one piece at a time. On the opposite side, small crates of root vegetables lined the floor-level shelves: potatoes, carrots, parsnips. I picked up a bag of baby carrots, already peeled, knowing they'd be perfect for snacking or tossing into a soup. I didn't need potatoes, but I took a moment to appreciate their rough skins and earthy scent anyway. Then I noticed a small bin of mushrooms, cremini, portobello, and white button. I crouched slightly to get a better look, the coolness of the display brushing my face. I chose a handful of white button mushrooms, placing them gently into a brown paper bag, folding the top twice so they'd stay clean. As I stood up again, I glanced down into my basket. It had grown heavy in my arm. Not unpleasantly so, but enough to feel meaningful. It was no longer empty. It carried decisions, small comforts, possibilities. I walked toward the scale near the center of the section. I never weighed produce here since everything was done at checkout, but I liked standing by it, a small pause before moving on. I shifted the basket to my other hand and took a breath. The produce section was always where I spent the most time. It was where the shopping felt the most human, the most grounded. I could have stayed longer, admiring the colors, the quiet rustle of plastic bags, the occasional clack of apples being res-tacked, but it was time to move forward. I walked slowly toward the end of the section, where the refrigerators began, humming softly to themselves. The dairy aisle was next. The refrigerated section greeted me with a subtle shift in temperature, not cold, but cool enough to raise a light awareness on my arms beneath the sleeves of my sweater. The soft hum of the refrigeration units blended with the ambient music and occasional murmur of a passing shopper. The lights here were whiter, a touch more clinical than those in the produce section, but still not harsh. Everything was neatly arranged behind glass doors, as if on display in a quiet museum of perishables. I approached the wall of milks and dairy alternatives, my eyes scanning across the rows. Almond, oat, soy, whole, skim, lactose-free. There were more options now than ever before. I reached for my usual, a beige carton of unsweetened oat milk, the one with soft green lettering and a leaf-shaped logo. Before placing it in my basket, I turned the carton to check the expiration date, even though I already knew it would be fine. It was more about the ritual. I always checked. I placed the carton gently into the basket, angling it so it wouldn't crush the tomatoes or bruising the apples. Then I took a few steps down to the egg section. The cartons were arranged in perfect rows, 12 to a shelf, stacked neatly 2 deep. I opened one of the cardboard lids, peeking inside to inspect the eggs, even though I knew they were probably fine. I always did this too, lifting the lid slowly, checking each white oval for cracks or smudges. These looked good. Clean. I closed the lid and placed the carton at the bottom of the basket, balancing it carefully. Next came the cheese. I didn't need anything fancy, just a small block of cheddar. I walked slowly along the cheese case, past wedges of brie and tubs of spreadable goat cheese, until I found the section I wanted. The cheddar blocks sat in uniform stacks, orange and pale yellow, sharp and mild. I picked up a medium-sharp variety, reading the label as I turned the package in my hand. The familiar plastic wrap was cool and firm, and I remembered how satisfying it was to slice thin pieces from it in the evenings, sometimes for sandwiches, sometimes just with crackers and tea. I placed it beside the oat milk. A few steps farther down, I paused by the yogurt section. Not because I needed any, but because I liked looking at the rows, cups in every color, stacked like tiny paint cans. Some had fruit on the bottom. Some were blended, some plain. I ran my fingers lightly across the tops of a few containers, stopping at one with a picture of a vanilla flower. After a few moments of quiet consideration, I selected a small container of vanilla Greek yogurt and added it to the basket. A quiet treat, something simple for breakfast or dessert. Just beyond the yogurt was the butter. Rectangular sticks in golden wrappers, packed into narrow boxes. I checked the label on my favorite brand, unsalted, and added it to the basket without much thought. It was more of a refill than a craving. The refrigerated shelves continued past the main dairy section into cold drinks, juices, and pre-made items. I usually skip this part, but today I found myself drawn toward the juice. A tall bottle of orange juice with pulp caught my eye. I hesitated, then placed it back. I didn't need it. Maybe next time. Instead, I moved to the refrigerated deli area, where shelves held things like hummus, fresh pasta, and dips. I paused in front of a small container of classic hummus. I hadn't planned to buy it, but I thought of how nice it would be with carrots or cucumber slices for a quick lunch. I added it to the basket with quiet satisfaction. From there, I approached the section of pre-cut fruit and packaged salads. I rarely bought these, not because they weren't good, but because I liked the slow preparation at home. Still, I looked at them each time. The fruit cups, layered with strawberries, melons, and blueberries, looked freshly made. I admired their neatness, the way they were arranged like little edible mosaics. Then I turned toward the wall of frozen goods, long freezers stretching in straight lines beneath glowing LED panels. A man stood a few doors down from me, examining a bag of frozen peas. We nodded politely as we passed each other. I opened the freezer door and felt the cold air brush over my hands. I wasn't planning on buying anything frozen, but I took a quick glance anyway. Bags of mixed vegetables, small pizzas, frozen berries. I spotted a small bag of frozen corn, the kind I sometimes added to soups. I considered it for a second, then decided against it. The door closed with a soft vacuum hiss, and I moved on. I passed through the last part of the refrigerated section, shelves of sliced meats, packaged tofu, and soy-based products. I didn't need anything from this area today, but I liked the familiarity of it. The way the shelves were always stocked the same way, the labels lined up with such precision. My basket was now beginning to feel heavier. Not too heavy, just enough to rest in the crook of my arm rather than dangle from my hand. I paused for a moment and gently shifted its weight, glancing at the contents. Oat milk, cheese, eggs, spinach, apples, peppers, yogurt. All nestled together like a puzzle of calm intentions. From here, the store's central aisles stretched ahead, tall shelves filled with dry goods, baking supplies, canned foods, and everything in between. Aisles where time could stretch, where decisions were slower, where memories sometimes surfaced from the scent of spices or the sight of a familiar label. I took a quiet breath and stepped forward, basket in hand, ready to begin the next part of the trip. Stepping into the first aisle of dry goods felt like entering a quieter, more focused part of the store. The cool air of the refrigerated section gave way to a gentler warmth. The shelves here rose tall on either side of me, forming soft walls of boxes, bags, and tins. The lighting was a little warmer too, bouncing softly off paper packaging and cardboard displays. It was quieter here, no humming from machines, no misting sounds, just the faint ambient music and the occasional squeak of a cartwheel somewhere down the line. This aisle held grains, beans, and pasta, one of my favorite sections. The shelves were orderly and colorful in a subtle way. I walked slowly past the bags of rice, each labeled in slightly different fonts and colors. Jasmine,
Basmati,
arborio,
brown.
I picked up a small bag of jasmine rice, my usual, and turned it over in my hands. The thin plastic crinkled lightly beneath my fingers. I checked the weight, the label, even though I've bought the same brand many times. It was part of the rhythm. I added it to the basket. Next were the lentils. Red, green, brown. I crouched slightly to examine the lower shelves. The green lentils were in a soft, matte bag with a clear window near the bottom. I liked how the pale green pebbles looked behind the plastic, quiet and uniform, like tiny stones in a shallow stream. I placed a bag in my basket, balancing it against the eggs. The pasta came next. Tall boxes lined the shelves like slim books, blue, cream, yellow. Penne, fusilli, farfalle. I usually chose spaghetti, but today I felt like something different. I picked up a box of linguine and turned it over, reading the cooking instructions even though I knew them by heart. 10 to 12 minutes.
Al dente.
I smiled and added it to the basket. As I turned a corner into the next aisle, the smells changed slightly. A faint whiff of cinnamon and vanilla drifted toward me. The baking aisle. Flour, sugar, cocoa, spices. I ran my fingers gently along the edge of a shelf, glancing at the small glass jars of cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. Their warm, familiar scents lingered around the labels. I wasn't planning to bake anything, but I picked up a small box of baking soda, just to restock. The box was light in my hand, soft from the floury coating on its surface. I placed it near the butter. The next section held snacks and crackers, biscuits and cookies. This aisle always made me feel like a child again. I slowed near the shelves of shortbread, the kind that comes in red plaid tins, and lingered at the rows of oat biscuits, ginger snaps, and sugar wafers. I didn't usually buy cookies, but I allowed myself a small indulgence today. A package of plain tea biscuits, the kind that soften perfectly when dipped in hot tea. I placed it carefully in the basket next to the yogurt. The cereal aisles stretched long and straight. Boxes in every color, some tall and thin, others square and flat. I passed them without stopping. I rarely ate cereal anymore, but the boxes reminded me of quieter mornings from years ago. I smiled softly at the thought. The next aisle was quieter still, paper goods and dry baking mixes. A man stood near the shelf of napkins, comparing two brands in silence. We shared a brief nod as I passed. I found the spices next. Small glass bottles and plastic jars lined up like tiny soldiers, each one offering a promise of flavor. I scanned the rows slowly. Thyme, rosemary, smoked paprika, turmeric. I wasn't in need of anything specific, but I paused at the black pepper grinders, turning one in my hand. The sound of the grinder inside gave a soft rattle. I added it to the basket. Farther along were dried beans, black beans, kidney cannellini, stacked in clear plastic bags. Their weight in the hand always felt substantial. I didn't need any today, but I admired the way the shelves were stocked, the way each type had its own place and texture. The shelves shifted to sauces and oils. Olive oil in tall glass bottles, golden under the lights. Vinegars of all kinds, balsamic, white wine, apple cider, resting with their labels angled just so. I picked up a bottle of olive oil and checked the cap, the seal. I had some left at home, but not much. This would last me weeks. I placed the bottle in my basket carefully, adjusting the oat milk to make space. Next came sauces: tomato, pesto, creamy garlic, marinara. I chose a jar of classic marinara, the label familiar and modest. I liked how the sauce looked behind the glass, thick, with visible herbs suspended in red. I turned the jar slowly, then nestled it next to the rice and lentils. A few more steps, and I came to canned goods: tomatoes, beans, soups, stocks. Their metal surfaces glinted under the lights. I selected a can of diced tomatoes and one of chickpeas, both staples in my pantry, both quietly reassuring. I checked my basket. It was full, but not overflowing. The handles pressed gently into my fingers. I took a moment to switch arms and continue, moving now into the snack aisle, even though I didn't plan to buy much there. Still, I slowed to examine the options. pretzels, pita chips,
popcorn.
I picked up a small bag of sea salt crackers, light, crisp, and familiar. Not necessary, but comforting. I tucked them near the cheese. At the end of the aisle, I stepped back and took a slow breath. The rows behind me were filled with small, deliberate choices. Every item had a purpose, even the spontaneous ones. There was still more to explore: the canned goods, the household aisle, and maybe the bakery, but I let myself rest here for a moment. My hand tightened slightly around the basket handle. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other and then turned toward the next aisle. The journey continued. The aisle for canned and bottled goods was slightly narrower than the others and quieter too. The shelves here were heavier, filled with jars and tins that gave off a muted clink when lifted. The air smelled faintly metallic, with a hint of dust and oil. It wasn't unpleasant, just familiar, the scent of long-shelved items, stable and waiting. I walked slowly along the first section, where rows of canned vegetables stretched from one end to the other. Corn, peas, green beans, beets, each label a muted green or yellow. Each can cool to the touch. I paused in front of the chickpeas. I already had a can in my basket, but I liked looking at the variety. Some brands were chunkier, some smoother, some packed in salted water, some in none at all. I picked up one with a blue label, checked the weight, and placed it back. Further along were the tomatoes, whole, crushed, diced, stewed. I gently picked up a can of San Marzano tomatoes, the label cream and red with a tiny gold emblem. I turned it in my hand slowly before setting it into the basket next to the pasta. A soft clink against the other can made me smile. It reminded me of stocking the pantry as a child, helping my mother organize groceries in neat rows. The next shelf held olives and pickles. Glass jars, tightly sealed. Some in brine, others in oil. I reached for a small jar of green olives, pitted and packed in a briny liquid that shimmered slightly in the light. I held the jar to my eye, turning it slowly. The olives rolled gently inside. I liked their color, soft green with little dimples. I added it to my basket. Just beyond the olives were jars of pasta sauces and condiments. Pesto in small green jars. Arrabbiata with flecks of chili. Vodka sauce with creamy pink swirls visible through the glass. I didn't need another sauce, but I admired the way the labels lined up, each one promising a different kind of dinner. There was something comforting about their presence, ready meals, waiting in silence. I moved on to the oils and vinegars, where tall glass bottles stood like sentinels. Olive oil in dark green glass. Canola and vegetable oils in plastic bottles with yellow caps. I had already picked up olive oil, but I paused to admire a small bottle of walnut oil, more for curiosity than intent. The label was elegant, handwritten in looping font, and I wonder how it might taste in a salad. Then came the vinegars: balsamic, apple cider, red wine, rice. I picked up a small bottle of balsamic, the kind I like to drizzle over tomatoes or roasted vegetables. I checked the seal, then placed it in the basket beside the crackers. At the far end of the aisle were condiments: mustard, ketchup, mayonnaise, hot sauce. The familiar bottles stood in rows, and I passed by them slowly, scanning out of habit rather than need. I paused in front of the mustard. There were so many varieties: Dijon, yellow, stone ground, spicy brown. I picked up a small jar of whole grain mustard, the kind with visible seeds. It was heavier than it looked. I added it to the basket. The next shelf down held jars of jams and honey. I always lingered here, even if I wasn't running low. There was something nostalgic about these items. I ran a finger along the label of a jar of strawberry jam, picturing toast with melted butter and jam pooled in its center. I smiled softly and chose a jar with a gingham lid, a small gesture to childhood breakfasts. The honey section was golden and glowing under the lights. Some jars were plastic bears, others tall glass cylinders with honey as clear as syrup. I didn't need honey, but I lifted a jar and tilted it gently, watching the thick liquid move inside like lava. After a long pause, I placed it back and kept walking. Then came the international section. Shelves with labels in other languages, sauces I didn't always recognize, but always respected. Soy sauce, hoisin, gochujang, coconut milk. I picked up a can of coconut milk. I hadn't planned on it, but I thought of a soup I might make later in the week. I liked its weight and the way the can felt slightly cold. It nestled nicely beside the chickpeas. The aisle ended in small displays of jarred artichokes, capers, roasted peppers, things with bold flavors and long shelf lives. I paused to admire a jar of sun-dried tomatoes, packed in oil. They looked intense, concentrated, ready to bring something to life. I didn't add them to the basket this time, but I made a mental note to come back for them. By now, my basket was growing heavier. My hand shifted slightly on the handle, adjusting for balance. I looked down and felt a quiet pride in the way the items sat together, colors, textures, possibilities. There was something deeply satisfying in their quiet cooperation. I turned slowly out of the aisle and into the open space again. Ahead was the bakery section, soft lighting, golden crusts, the scent of yeast and flour drifting into the air like a whisper. I took one more breath and stepped forward. As I approached the bakery section, the air seemed warmer, softer somehow. The scents were different here, rounder, sweeter. A mixture of flour, butter, sugar, and something faintly spicy, like cinnamon or nutmeg. The space was arranged more openly than the previous aisles, with wide wooden shelves, low counters, and soft lighting that made everything appear golden. The bread display was the first to greet me. A long wooden table held crusty baguettes, loaves of sourdough, and rounds of multi-grain bread, each resting in linen-lined baskets or brown paper trays. I reached out and gently pressed my fingers against a sourdough loaf. The crust was firm and crackled slightly beneath my touch, while the base was still faintly warm. I imagined slicing into it at home, spreading butter while the crumb was still tender. I placed the loaf in my basket, angling it gently across the top so it wouldn't press too firmly into the eggs or spinach. Next were the rolls. Small, soft, sprinkled with seeds or brushed with egg wash. I chose two, one sesame, one plain, and placed them into a brown paper bag, folding the top over with quiet care. I liked having just a few rolls, enough for 1 or 2 meals. No waste, no decision fatigue. A few steps away, a long glass case held pastries, croissants, danishes, muffins, and scones. The croissants looked especially good today, their flaky layers catching the light, golden and crisp at the edges. I debated for a moment. Then I smiled and picked one up with the small metal tongs, placing it gently in another paper bag. A small reward, I thought. Something for later with tea. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing I hadn't planned for it, and yet it now waited for me. A soft, warm treat tucked into my basket. Just beyond the pastry case was a short shelf with cookies and biscotti. I lingered, letting my fingers trace the edges of a box of almond biscotti. It reminded me of a time when I used to visit a small cafe downtown, always ordering the same thing, an Americano and one long, crunchy cookie. I didn't take any today, but I let the memory stay with me for a while. Next came the cakes and prepared desserts, whole cakes, slices in plastic containers, cups of pudding, tarts wrapped in delicate foil trays. I rarely bought anything from here, but I still looked. I admired the handwriting on the labels, the way the whipped cream was piped in smooth spirals, the glossy sheen of a lemon tart under the glass. A woman stood near the cakes, reading each label carefully. Her cart was half full, a box of pasta, a bunch of bananas, a small potted plant. She caught my eye for just a moment, smiled, and returned to reading. I liked that, a quiet acknowledgement, nothing more. I moved toward the shelves of sweets and packaged snacks. The chocolate bars were arranged by percentage: milk, 60%, 72%, even 90%. I ran my finger along the edge of one dark chocolate bar with sea salt. The paper wrapper was thick, almost cloth-like. I turned it over, reading the ingredients.
Simple. Clean.
I added it to the basket. Nearby, a small display offered individually wrapped candies, soft caramels, peppermints, licorice twists. I took none, but paused in front of the caramels, remembering how I used to carry a few in my bag when I worked at the library. Something about unwrapping one quietly in the middle of the day had felt like a gentle rebellion. Beyond the sweets was a tiny alcove with teas and coffees, tucked beside the bakery like a whispered invitation. I turned into it and smiled. Boxes of tea lined the narrow shelves: chamomile, peppermint, English breakfast, rooibos, jasmine. I reached for my favorite brand of black tea, the one I drank nearly every morning. The box was the same color it had always been, deep navy with gold lettering. I added it to the basket without hesitation. Next to the teas were small jars of jam and honey, even though I'd seen a larger selection earlier. These were more decorative, tiny jars wrapped with string or capped with patterned paper. I didn't buy one, but I admired the care in their presentation. On the lowest shelf were tins of biscuits, round, floral, nostalgic. The kind you open slowly, half expecting to find sewing supplies instead of cookies. I let my eyes wander across the designs, not choosing any, but appreciating their quiet, pastel elegance. My basket was now comfortably full. The croissant rested on top, the bread peeking out from its paper sleeve, and the chocolate nestled safely between the tea and spinach. The items were balanced like a small story: breakfast, lunch, a treat, a quiet dinner. It felt whole, like enough. Not excessive, not rushed, just enough. I stood still for a few seconds, listening to the ambient music, a piano melody that drifted down from hidden speakers, soft and without urgency. I liked it here. I could have stayed longer, but I had more aisles to visit. Cleaning supplies, maybe some household items, a final walkthrough to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything. I turned slowly and made my way toward the back of the store again. The basket shifted slightly in my hand, its weight familiar now. A quiet companion. Leaving the bakery behind, I made my way toward the back of the store where the cleaning supplies and household goods were kept. The air here was different, not scented with food, but with faint traces of lemon, plastic, and paperboard. The sound seemed softer in this part of the store, like the shelves themselves absorbed footsteps and cartwheels. No one else was in this aisle. I walked alone, slowly, as if entering a storage wing of a library. The shelves were tall and practical, stocked with utilitarian items. Bottles of dish soap lined the top shelf, their bright colors and curved labels standing in uniform rows. I scanned the options: lavender, citrus, unscented, and picked up the one I usually used, a pale green bottle with a small leaf on the front. I liked how mild it smelled and how well it foamed. I held it for a moment, then placed it into the basket, tucking it between the olive oil and the chocolate bar. Next were sponges. I paused to examine a small pack of two, one side soft, one side scrubbed with a rough texture. I liked the feel of the plastic wrap, thin and crinkly. The sponges inside were a cheerful yellow. I added them without much deliberation. I walked slowly past the paper towels and napkins. The rolls stood upright in their plastic sleeves, bunched together like small towers. I didn't need any, but I touched one of the packages lightly with my fingertips, the plastic smooth and cool. Then came the candles and matches, a surprise every time I saw them here, nestled between dish detergent and trash bags. I paused in front of a display of small, unscented tea lights. There was something peaceful about them. Their soft metal cups, their promise of quiet flickering light. I picked up a box and added it to the basket. I could almost picture them lit on the windowsill that evening, glowing gently against the glass. The air here was still. I could hear the hum of the overhead lights more clearly. It wasn't unpleasant, just ever-present, like the hush in an empty classroom after everyone has gone home. A few shelves over were plastic storage containers, clear tubs with colored lids in various sizes. I didn't need any, but I admired the organization of it all. Stacks within stacks, arranged with purpose. I liked knowing that things could fit so neatly into place, even if I didn't need to buy anything today. Further down, I came across trash bags, zip-top sandwich bags, foil, and parchment paper. I realized I was nearly out of foil and reached for a small box, the familiar brand with the shiny lettering. The cardboard was firm, and the roll inside had a slight weight to it. I added it to the basket with the same care as everything else. Then there was the shelf of laundry items, detergents, fabric softeners, dryer sheets. Their scents mingled in the air, floral and soapy. I didn't need any this time, but I took a moment to read the label on a small lavender-scented detergent bottle. It promised calm, relaxation, and softness. I smiled slightly at the poetry of such a promise printed on plastic. At the very end of the aisle was a display of seasonal items. Nothing too elaborate. Just a few woven baskets, a folded picnic blanket, and a stack of kitchen towels with tiny embroidered pears and apples. I lifted one towel, ran my thumb across the stitching, and placed it gently back. By now, my basket had reached a fullness that felt almost complete. There was space for one or two more things, but the weight told me I was nearing the end of my route. I stood still for a few moments in the quiet of the aisle, surrounded by objects of simple purpose. Things made to clean, contain, wrap, absorb. These weren't glamorous items.
No color, no indulgence.
But they carried with them the comfort of order, the idea that life could be tidied, managed, cared for in small, steady ways. I took one last look down the aisle, then turned the corner, back toward the main path of the store. Just one more look through the aisles, I thought. A final walk through, just to be sure I hadn't forgotten anything. I re-entered the central part of the store, weaving gently between carts and quiet footsteps. This was always the part of my grocery trips I liked best, not because of the products themselves, but because of the mood. The list had been fulfilled. The basket was full. The weight of decision-making had passed. Now I was simply drifting, moving through the store like a visitor rather than a seeker. I turned down one aisle I'd skipped earlier, snacks and packaged goods. I didn't need anything from here, but I wandered slowly down its length anyway. There was something soothing about seeing things in tidy rows. Crackers, trail mix, granola bars, dried fruit. Each box and bag stood still, waiting for a hand to reach out. I paused in front of a row of trail mixes, the kind with almonds, dried cranberries, bits of dark chocolate. The idea of having a small jar of it on the kitchen counter made me pause. I picked up a bag, read the ingredients, and smiled softly at the familiarity. I placed it in the basket, even though it hadn't been on the list. On the opposite shelf were small packets of dried mango slices. I considered them for a long moment, imagining their chewy texture and concentrated sweetness. But I left them on the shelf. Some cravings, I thought, are meant to stay in the mind. Farther down the aisle was a small section for novelty items, seasonal chocolate, mints in decorative tins, tiny packets of flavored almonds, chocolate-covered espresso beans. I picked up a tin of mints, soft green with a vintage design. The kind of thing that lives in the bottom of a purse for months, slowly disappearing one by one. I added it quietly, like a secret. I passed by the display of gum and candy. Peppermint, spearmint, cinnamon. I touched one pack lightly, then moved on. Before heading to checkout, I did a slow circle past the refrigerated section again, not to buy anything more, but to be sure I hadn't forgotten. I glanced once more at the eggs, the oat milk, the cheese, all already in my basket. I didn't stop, but I felt a calm confidence knowing everything I'd come for was now with me. As I neared the end of the aisle, I saw a display I hadn't noticed earlier, a small wooden crate filled with cloth tote bags for sale, each with a simple print, flowers, lemons, simple phrases in cursive. One read, "Take it slow," in soft blue letters across beige cotton. I smiled. It felt like the motto of my entire afternoon. I touched it, considered it, then let it be. The store was a little busier now. A soft murmur had risen in the air, not loud, but present. The quiet of early morning was giving way to the gentle tide of midday shoppers. I watched an elderly man carefully load cans into his cart, counting as he went. A young woman, maybe a student, held her phone in one hand and a box of tea in the other, comparing prices. A child sat in a cart seat, holding a small stuffed rabbit, talking softly to it while their parent chose apples. I liked seeing people in their own rhythms, moving, choosing, living quietly alongside one another without speaking. I turned into the last aisle one more time, where the checkout lanes were visible at the far end. But I didn't head there yet. Instead, I took one last glance at a small impulse stand near the register. Lip balm, hand sanitizer, batteries, notebooks. The notebooks were small, pocket-sized, with plain covers and paper that looked slightly textured. I picked one up, opened the front, and touched the page with my fingertip. Blank, but promising. I didn't buy it, but I liked knowing it was there. I tightened my grip on the basket handle. It had grown heavier than I remembered, the leather strap pressing softly into the palm of my hand. My shoulder ached slightly, but not uncomfortably. It was the ache of completion. The list had been lived through, not just followed. It was time to check out. The checkout lanes stretched out in a neat row along the front of the store, each one gently lit and softly humming with activity. I stood for a moment at the entrance to the area, letting my eyes scan across the options. A few lanes were open, some with lines, others with just one or two shoppers waiting. I didn't mind waiting. I preferred it, in fact. It gave me a moment to pause, to prepare for the final step. I moved into the line behind a woman with a half-full cart. She wore a light gray sweater and had headphones in, swaying slightly to music I couldn't hear. She glanced back and gave me a soft smile before returning to unloading her items. Her cart was filled with vegetables, a box of cereal, a small bouquet of tulips, and a carton of eggs balanced delicately on top. I rested the basket on the floor for a moment, grateful to release its weight. I flexed my fingers and rolled my shoulder gently, feeling the familiar echo of tension that always settled there after carrying something for a while. Around me, the store buzzed quietly, the soft beeping of scanners, the murmur of brief conversations, the occasional rustle of plastic bags. When it was my turn, I lifted my basket onto the conveyor belt, taking my time. I like to group things loosely by category, produce together, dairy next, dry goods at the end. It helped the process feel smoother, more intentional. The cashier greeted me with a quiet, "Hi there," her voice calm and low, and I responded with a small nod and smile. She was a woman probably in her 50s, with short hair tucked behind her ears, and a gentle demeanor. Her name tag said Lena. She moved with steady, practiced efficiency, not rushed, but confident in every motion. I appreciated that. She began scanning my items one by one, and the scanner gave off soft, consistent beeps, each one spaced just far enough apart to feel unhurried. Apples. Beep. Oat milk. Beep. A loaf of sourdough, which she held carefully, turning it to find the barcode. Beep. She placed each item gently into a paper bag, which I'd requested with a small gesture toward the sign. She nodded in understanding, saying nothing, but handling the request with ease. The croissant was placed into its own small bag, separate from the rest, a quiet luxury. The eggs were packed last, cushioned by a roll of paper towels and the bag of spinach. I watched her work, feeling a sense of gratitude for the care she took. As she scanned the last item, the chocolate bar, she paused for just a second, as though recognizing the brand. "These are really good," she said, not making eye contact, but speaking with quiet sincerity. I smiled softly. "I always try to leave with something sweet." She gave a tiny nod, and the moment passed. The screen displayed my total. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my wallet. The card slid smoothly through the reader. Approved. A small receipt printed, curling like a ribbon from the machine. Lena handed it to me without a word. I gathered the bags into my arms, 2 in total, just the right amount. The weight was balanced now, evenly distributed. The bread rested on top of one bag, the eggs near the top of the other. I adjusted the straps on my shoulder and offered a quiet thank you. She looked up and smiled gently. "Have a peaceful day." Her words stayed with me as I walked toward the doors. The doors slid open with a soft breath, and I stepped back out into the open air. It was a little warmer now than it had been earlier. The clouds overhead were lighter, thinner in places, letting pale sunlight filter through in patches across the sidewalk. The air smelled faintly of warm pavement and leaves, with just a trace of something sweet drifting from the bakery nearby. The bags rested easily on my shoulders, not too heavy, not awkward, and I began the walk home, taking the same path, but moving more slowly now. My steps felt different with the bags in hand, more deliberate, grounded. I shifted the weight slightly to one side, then the other, until I found a rhythm that worked. As I passed the bakery again, the door was open. The scent of fresh bread was stronger now, warm and rich, wrapping around me like a blanket. I didn't stop, but I smiled as I passed. The croissant in my bag felt even more special now, like a secret already waiting for me at home. I turned down the quieter street near the park, where the trees arched overhead and the sidewalk curved gently past the benches. A woman sat with a book in her lap, her dog lying at her feet. She looked up as I passed, and we exchanged a soft glance, not quite a greeting, but something kind and mutual. The wind stirred the pages of her book. The park itself was still, except for the occasional flutter of leaves and the distant call of a bird. I paused for a moment by the birch trees, letting one hand brush the white bark. The roughness of it was comforting, real. The grocery bags shifted against my side as I stood there, and I adjusted them gently, taking another step forward. As I moved on, the sounds of the city began to return. The soft hiss of a bus braking in the distance, the faint hum of traffic, a bicycle bell from somewhere I couldn't see. They didn't disturb me. They just reminded me I was making my way through a world that was always in motion, even when I chose to move slowly. I passed the bookstore again, still closed, the lights inside now casting longer shadows. A cat sat on the windowsill, blinking slowly, its tail wrapped neatly around its body. I waved to it, quietly, knowing it wouldn't respond. It watched me pass without moving. Crossing the last intersection before home, I waited for the light. A young couple stood across from me, holding hands, talking softly to each other. I watched them smile, not hearing their words, just the shape of their moment. The light changed, and we crossed paths without speaking. Finally, I reached my building. The front door felt heavier than usual, or perhaps my arms were just a little tired now. I pushed it open with my shoulder and stepped into the quiet of the entryway. The familiar smell of warm wood and old carpet wrapped around me like memory. I climbed the stairs slowly, my footsteps light, the bags gently bumping against my sides. At my door, I paused again, a final moment before re-entering the stillness of my home. I shifted the bags to one hand, reached for my keys, and opened the door. Inside, everything was as I had left it.
Calm.
Soft light filtered through the curtains, and the silence was warm, not empty. I set the bags down gently on the kitchen counter, exhaling as I did, not from exhaustion, but from a kind of quiet completion. I had gone and returned. I stood for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen, the bags resting on the counter, slightly crumpled but intact. The air inside was still, gently warm, with a faint scent of wood and paper, the smell of my apartment when it's been undisturbed for a few hours. I ran my hand lightly across the countertop and then slowly reached into the first bag. There was no rush. I always liked this part, the quiet unpacking, the act of returning things to their places. It felt like a ritual, a soft punctuation mark at the end of the afternoon. I lifted out the loaf of sourdough first. Its crust was still firm, and I tapped it gently with my knuckles, liking the hollow sound it made. I placed it on the wooden cutting board by the stove and tucked the paper sleeve neatly underneath. Then came the eggs, carefully removed and opened to check one last time. All intact. I slid the carton into its usual place in the refrigerator, on the middle shelf, where it wouldn't get jostled. The oat milk went next to it, behind the jar of pickles, followed by the small container of yogurt and the wedge of cheddar cheese. I stacked the spinach bag lightly on top of the lettuce and rearranged the vegetable drawer just a bit so everything fit with space to breathe. From the second bag, I unpacked the apples and placed them gently into the ceramic fruit bowl on the counter. They rolled softly into place, settling against one another like old friends. The bananas I kept separate. I placed them on the wooden trivet near the window, where the light would help them ripen just a little more. Next came the pantry items. I opened the cupboard and took out the nearly empty rice jar, pouring in the fresh jasmine rice slowly, listening to the small cascade of grains like soft sand. The lentils followed, finding their place beside the pasta and canned tomatoes. The olive oil was set back into its familiar corner, its glass bottle catching the light as I moved it. I paused briefly at the spice rack and added the new pepper grinder. It clicked into place between the salt and thyme. Just looking at it made me feel like I had done something thoughtful for myself. The chocolate bar I tucked into the tin on the shelf above the sink, a small personal stash, folded closed with quiet care. The crackers and trail mix went into the dry goods drawer, stacked beside jars of peanut butter and tea biscuits. I liked knowing they were there, even if I wouldn't reach for them right away. The dish soap went beneath the sink, replacing the old bottle that had just run dry. I wiped the shelf with a cloth before placing it down. The box of foil was slid into the drawer with the baking paper and sandwich bags, a satisfying clink as it hit the back. From the smallest paper bag, I retrieved the croissant. I placed it on a small plate, uncovered. I wanted it to breathe a little before I made tea. The last item was the box of tea I'd picked up, my favorite kind. I opened the tin on the shelf, removed the last of the older leaves, and poured in the fresh ones. The scent rose gently, warm, earthy, calming. I closed the tin and placed it back into its corner. When everything had been put away, I folded the grocery bags along their creases and returned them to the cloth bin near the door. I always did that last, a small gesture that meant the trip was truly over. I stood for a moment in the center of the kitchen, looking around. Everything was quiet again. The fridge was fuller, the counters cleared. The rhythm of the day had slowed back to stillness. I filled a kettle with fresh water and set it on the stove. As it heated, I placed the croissant on a napkin, broke off a corner, and tasted it, crisp at the edge, soft inside, with just a hint of sweetness. I poured the tea slowly, the steam rising in lazy spirals. Then I sat at the table by the window, the afternoon light falling softly across my hands. Outside, the street was still, just a few leaves tumbling lazily along the sidewalk. I sipped my tea, took another bite, and let my shoulders fall into rest. There was nothing left to do. The groceries were away. The kitchen was quiet. The day had moved in a gentle arc from tea to tea again. And now I was home.